Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Wright, and I'm the co-chair of programming for the JASNA Greater Louisville region and a member of the Jane Austen Virtual Festival team. I hope you are having a wonderful time at our virtual festival this summer. 3 things you should know about me before I start this talk, which I am calling Unveiling Lyme Regis, Jane Austen's Persuasion and Anning. So, number 1, I am a geologist and I know a bit about fossils. The history of life is one of my favorite things to teach at my university. 2, I am an amateur Jane Austen scholar and I love tying aspects of her novels in with gemology and geology, hence this talk. And 3, I have never been to Lyme Regis, but because of its literary and geologic history, it is at the top of my list of places to go when I finally cross the Atlantic. So let's get started. Lyme Regis appears in Jane Austen's last full novel, Persuasion, in only 2 chapters, but her writing in these chapters reveals her admiration for the coastal town. Lyme is tucked into the valley created by the River Lim, or Buddle, as it is called locally. And you can get a sense of the topography in this image with its view to the west with the town in the middle. The people are standing on the hills of one side of the valley, which plummets into the town. Then you can see the upswing in the terrain on the other side. This beautiful landscape made for difficult travel to Lyme until better roads were built in the 18th century. In fact, there was no wheeled traffic at all until 1759, when local businessmen decided to capitalize on the popularity of coastal resort towns and try to transform Lyme into one. Lyme Regis was originally built on the wool and wine industries, but these began to falter in the 18th century as the wool trade moved to the north and the wine trade to France. Many deserted the place to seek livelihoods elsewhere, leaving a large number of buildings to decay. Then Thomas Hollis and others had the bright idea to emulate seaside towns like Brighton. The economy of Lyme Regis was saved from collapse in the 18th century, the late 18th century, by the travel industry, which provides a major source of revenue there even today. Jane Austen is a large part of this attraction, but we will also discuss aspects of the region that attracted her to visit and stay there during the summer and fall of both 1803 and 1804, as well as other attractants for people today. This is an engraving by Walker from an original drawing by Nixon, drawn in 1796. The Cobb can be seen stretching out into the sea. Lyme Regis is a small town on the Dorset coast of England, right at the western edge of the county. Its location exposes the town to English Channel winds and tides, but also enables it to be a seaport for the export of goods. Its proper name is Lyme Regis, but Jane only calls it Lyme in her writing. This may have been a jab at the Prince Regent. And for those of you familiar with the history of the publication of Emma will know a little bit about what I'm talking about. Or it might have just been the fashion at the time, as there was no other Lyme in the country. Using the whole name became more popular later on with the increase in civic pride, or at least this is the current hypothesis. The name means King's Lyme, and is named so because Edward I gave it a royal charter in 1284, after which the townspeople had to pay rent and taxes to the royal exchequer. Yay! So what can you find when you go to Lyme Regis? Those of you who have been fortunate enough to go on a JASNA or Jane Austen themed trip to England may have already visited Lyme Regis, maybe even multiple times, and I welcome your reflections and comments during the Q&A after this talk. In the meantime, I've found quite a few Austen-related sites one can visit in the town, many with rather tenuous ties to the author. You can visit Pin House, the most probable location of the Austens' lodgings, in 1804, based on the name of her landlord at the time, a Mr. Pin, and an 1824 plan of the town showing the house was owned by a William Pin, Esquire. You can visit the sites of the two inns in existence when Jane was in Lyme, and that might have been inspired, or that might have inspired the inn scenes of Persuasion. Their names at the time were the Three Cups and the Lion, although one has now been reconstructed across the street from its original location, and the other has been significantly altered. You can go to the assembly rooms. You cannot, I'm sorry, you cannot go to the assembly rooms Jane visited because they are now a car park. But you can go onto the Jane Austen Garden, built on the site of a house she was supposed to have stayed in, although it was most likely built after the time of her visits. You can even visit what is called Captain Harville's cottage, although, as Jane wrote in Persuasion, quote, "there is nothing to admire in the buildings themselves," unquote. And in fact, most of the buildings present in Lyme during her day are now gone or significantly renovated. And this is due to the continual weathering by the sea and the wind. Even the bust in her namesake garden continually suffers the weathering of the sea winds and storms. And I'm wondering what in the world it is made out of, because there are rock types that are somewhat carvable, maybe not as easily as marble, but that do withstand weathering a little bit better. Maybe I should talk to them. This perpetual erosion may seem like a negative aspect of the location, but as we'll see, it also has major benefits in terms of making discoveries. The touristy spots on this map, from the informative but all too short Jane Austen and Lyme Regis by Maggie Lane, with their tenuous and suspect connections with Jane, are not what she meant when she wrote, again in Persuasion, quote, "a scene so wonderful and so lovely is exhibited as may more than equal any of the resembling scenes of the far-famed Isle of Wight. These places must be visited and visited again to make the worth of Lyme understood," unquote. Now let us investigate the attractions of Lyme that are more clearly connected to Jane and her novel, and that are more interesting to me. In Persuasion, the group of travelers from Uppercross, including our heroine, Anne Elliot, head directly to the Cobb after finding rooms at an inn and ordering dinner. I probably would too, maybe even before finding a place to stay. In her letter to Cassandra, dated September 14th, 1804, Jane wrote that she visited with a Miss Armstrong, and that, quote, "we afterwards walked together for an hour on the Cobb," unquote. The Cobb is a semicircular pier stretching out into the sea, built as a gigantic breakwater for storms that frequently threatened the town from the southwest. There is not really a natural harbor at Lyme Regis, as the coastline is naturally a bit too straight. So the Cobb was built sometime before the year 1250 to provide shelter for ships coming in, leading to the boom that I talked about in the wine and wool trades in the region. The name Cobb possibly comes from the fact that, at least at first, it was constructed out of cobblestones jammed between oak trunks and constantly had to be rebuilt, as you can imagine, especially after severe storms. These days, more modern materials like concrete are used to keep the stones in place, but it still frequently requires repairs due to its constant exposure to waves and wind. The Cobb enabled Lyme Regis to be economically viable for 5 centuries until the wine and wool industries declined during the 18th century, and residents fleeing from more prosperous regions left parts of the town deserted and in disrepair until visitors started to arrive for the sea bathing, sublime vistas, and increasing improvements and accommodations for travelers. The Cobb was a popular walk for visitors to Lyme, with paths both on the upper level, open to the sea, and the more sheltered lower level, 8 feet or so below. It has often been breached and rebuilt, but still stands today very much as it did in Austen's time. Lyme Regis quickly evolved from a port in economic decline to a seaside recreation destination during the second half of the 18th century, when seaside resorts were booming in popularity, and they did so during the entirety of Jane's lifetime. I'm sure many of you have seen the dramatization of her partial novel Sanditon, right? All the sea bathing and stuff that went on there. Seaside resort town. One reason for this craze was the restrictions on travel to the continent during the French Revolution, a very scary time, and the resulting Napoleonic Wars. So the upper classes of England focused on travel within Britain, a much safer option. Another reason for the rise in resort towns was the general improvement in roads and carriages, making travel for pleasure an actual pleasure rather than a hugely uncomfortable hassle. Also, sea bathing became an important health restorative after the publication of Dr. Russell's dissertation on its benefits. And finally, people were seeking out natural destinations to get a taste of the picturesque and the sublime, discussed by authors such as William Gilpin and Edmund Burke. They were more likely to encounter landscapes that epitomize these qualities in wilder areas than could be found in Bath or Brighton. So Lyme was in a perfect position to meet that need. However, improvements in accommodations for upper-class travelers were required, and the walk in Lyme provided a relatively safe means of observing the splendor of the sea. These two depictions of the walk, the constructed footpath between the town and the beach, are from the mid-19th century, but give you a sense of the scale and view both towards the west, as in the top image, and to the east in the bottom image. The walk was renamed the Marine Parade in 1826, but I prefer to think of it as Jane did, so I'll call it the walk, even when I eventually visit. It was the path Jane and her characters in Persuasion took to get to the beach, and how Jane reached the sea to bathe. Like the buildings in this coastal town, the walk is continually damaged by the sea and repaired or rebuilt. The houses along the walk suffer foundational problems in addition to weathering because of the instability of the land itself. Jane would have taken many walks along the walk, with her family members and acquaintances, especially when the footpaths to Charmouth were too muddy. Right at the east end of the walk were the assembly rooms, painted here by Reed in 1815. Jane visited the rooms on occasion and had attended at least one ball there during the Austen family's visit in 1804, at least according to her letter to her sister. The rooms were originally completed in 1775 after Thomas Hollis knocked down old wool and cloth warehouses so they could be built. He did not live to see their completion, but succeeded in his goals for Lyme as a tourist spot. The assembly rooms, as you can see from the painting, were constantly buffeted by wind and waves, and therefore constantly in need of repairs. They were irreparably damaged by a major storm in 1927 and were demolished. The spot, as I said before, is now a car park. Interestingly, though, the steps near the former site of the assembly rooms are the most likely spot the Musgrove party ascended when they first encountered Mr. Elliot. The original steps are gone now, but this was an important spot in the novel nonetheless, because it is here that Anne's physical beauty is refreshed and Captain Wentworth rediscovers his attraction to Anne. Austen writes, quote, "When they came to the steps leading upwards from the beach, a gentleman at the same moment preparing to come down, politely drew back and stopped to give them way. They ascended and passed him, and as they passed, Anne's face caught his eye, and he looked at her with a degree of earnest admiration, which she could not be insensible of. She was looking remarkably well, her very regular, very pretty features, having the bloom and freshness of youth restored by the fine wind which had been blowing on her complexion, and by the animation of eye which it had also produced. It was evident that the gentleman admired her exceedingly. Captain Wentworth looked round at her instantly, in a way which showed his noticing of it. He gave her a momentary glance, a glance of brightness, which seemed to say, 'That man is struck with you.' And even I, at this moment, see something like Anne Elliot again, unquote. The seaside storms may have destroyed the assembly rooms, but a modicum of that weather helped to highlight Anne's natural beauty, gain her an admirer, and remind an old one of her charms. If you have read Persuasion or have seen one of the film versions, you are likely to remember the harrowing scene in which Louisa Musgrove falls and loses consciousness. There are a few possibilities for Jane's inspiration as to the steps from the upper Cobb to the lower Cobb from which Louisa fell. And while I won't go into the evidence for and against each one of them, I will show you a few examples. These steps are called Granny's Teeth. They are certainly the scariest and were used to depict the scene in the 1995 BBC version of Persuasion starring Amanda Root. Yay! I would be terrified to try them in the winter or in the rain, and it is really hard for me to imagine Louisa running up them, even in dry weather, although the thought of surviving a careful traverse would be exhilarating, I guess. Thrill seekers? Either way, you can visit them today and reenact the pivotal scene from the novel, but please do so carefully and at your own risk. These Janeites in the lower photograph have managed to increase the carnage. The person who posted this photograph titled it Group Tragedy. Another caption could be a pile of Louisa's and Henrietta's, seeing as how Henrietta fainted soon after her sister fell. I'm imagining Mary Musgrove screaming in hysterics, and all of these characters presenting a striking contrast to the sensible and sympathetic Anne. Another possibility for the infamous steps are these, the gin shop steps. Gin meaning another word for crane or hoist. These were used in the 1971 movie version of the novel, and in this engraving in a 1975 version of the book. Wherever the setting of Louisa's fall, it's a crucial turning point in the novel. Anne's calm efficiency in the face of the severe stress of Louisa's accident prompted Captain Wentworth to declare her the most capable of helping Louisa when they were deciding who should go back to Uppercross. Being called capable is not exactly romantic, but he spoke to her about staying with such feeling that she blushed and, quote, thought that it could scarcely escape him to feel that a persuadable temper might sometimes be as much in favor of happiness as a resolute one, unquote. And she was right. This episode in Lyme caused the tide to turn, pun intended, in terms of Captain Wentworth's affections and thoughts of the future. This episode also resulted in a change in Louisa, forcing her to remain in Lyme until she sufficiently recovered. She and Captain Benwick got to know each other during their convalescence. Would she have been interested in the pensive Benwick if her head injury had not calmed her boisterous personality? I don't think so. They discovered each other and got engaged as a result of her accident on the Cobb. Her accident also forced Anne to go back to Uppercross to tell her parents. If she hadn't, she might have gotten engaged to Captain Benwick. So Louisa's fall was an extremely important part of the story. There are many threads on Jane Austen online forums about the arguments for each set of stairs along the Cobb as to the fateful scene. And look, I even found this really cool chart depicting said scene in 3 of the most recent movie versions of Persuasion. On the left, we have impending doom, and on the right, we have doom, 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 at least according to the hysterical Mary and the fainting Henrietta. Anne, on the other hand, stifled her alarm and set to problem solving, further revealing her merits, to the men in the company at least. People revealed themselves in other ways in Lyme. Did any of you watch Sanditon? Sea bathing became popular in England after Dr. Richard Russell wrote his 1752 treatise on the health benefits of drinking seawater and bathing in the sea. He especially recommended bathing in cold water early in the morning, when I imagine the experience would be quite an eye-opener. The practice became so prevalent that a method was developed to allow women to participate and retain their modesty. Wheeled bathing machines were rolled out into the water, and the women, often with female bathing assistants, could get into the water out of the view of people on the shore. The TV show Sanditon depicted Charlotte and Clara in red bathing dresses stepping out of one such contraption and into the arms of women already in the water. The horse driver was supposed to keep his eyes front, so I'm confused by this upper image from the mid-19th century in which the horse seems to be going forward into the water rather than backing up. Perhaps he planned to circle around, as I'm not certain how easy it would be to put a horse in reverse. Oops, I'm not quite done. We know that Jane Austen went sea bathing during her 1804 visit to Lyme from her September letter to Cassandra, in which she wrote, quote, "The bathing was so delightful this morning, and Molly so pressing with me to enjoy myself, that I believe I stayed in rather too long. And since the middle of the day I felt unreasonably tired. I shall be more careful another time, and shall not bathe tomorrow as I had before intended," unquote. It appears that Jane discovered the therapeutic practice to be perhaps too much fun, which is what I imagine happens to a lot of little kids the first time they go to the ocean. I remember taking my son, and he completely wore himself out, splashing in the waves. I'll give you a second to take in these images while I get a sip of tea here. So women mostly wore linen shifts while sea bathing to cover themselves, although some bathed naked, which was just as well because the white shifts left very little to the imagination when wet. Perhaps this is why George Cruikshank, in his caricature of sea bathing and in the craze of sea bathing at Lyme Regis, depicts female bathers in the nude. Were they nude, or did they just appear so because their wet linen shifts were basically transparent? In the film version of Sanditon, Clara and Charlotte are wearing red sea bathing costumes, so I'd be interested in researching that if that was actually historically accurate. Either way, the gentleman, if you can call him that, in the far right of the image seems to be enjoying himself immensely. The beach at Lyme is certainly a place of discovery for him, both of the sublime and the beautiful. In Jane's novel, Mary Musgrove is the only character who actually goes sea bathing at Lyme, and she does so in November. All that is said, though, is that she bathed, so it is possible she took advantage of the indoor baths built in Lyme in 1804, offering private cubicles, warmed water, and refreshments. This would be a much less mind and eye-opening experience than the late autumn ocean, but seems more like the petulant Mary's kind of therapy. Jane Austen enjoyed exploring the rocky coast and inlets in and around Lyme with her brother Henry, who accompanied her and her parents and Cassandra when they visited in 1804. They took long walks along the cliffs to neighboring villages like Charmouth to the east, from which this view by Thomas Girton was painted in 1797. And in this photograph, taken on the trail you can walk along today. In such a glorious location, one can imagine Cassandra being inspired to sketch and then use watercolors to depict her sister, as we see here in the only authenticated image of Jane, currently on display at the National Portrait Gallery in London. And of course, it's from her back. Perhaps it was completed during one of their rambles between Lyme and Charmouth. In her description of Lyme and Persuasion, Jane Austen writes, "The scenes in its neighborhood, Charmouth, with its high grounds and extensive sweeps of country, and still more its sweet retired bay, backed by dark cliffs, where fragments of low rock among the sands make it the happiest spot for watching the flow of the tide, for sitting in unwearied contemplation," unquote. In the drawing below, titled Lyme Regis from Charmouth, Dorset, by William Daniel, You can't really see the town of Lyme at all because it is nestled in the River Lyme Valley and somewhat protected from the winds. However, it is built on notoriously unstable rocks from the early Jurassic period of Earth's history called the Blue Lias Formation. You can see the alternating layers of shales and limestones, a combination of rocks also common around Cincinnati, where I was born and raised, and that got me interested in geology in the first place. Although those rocks are from a much earlier time period. Landslides are common in the Blue Lias, making Lyme and the entirety of the Dorset coast a somewhat hazardous place to live, especially on the edge or downslope from the cliffs, just like in Cincinnati, although of course Cincinnati is not on the shoreline. The Blue Lias near Lyme Regis is famous for its fossils, including these ammonites, which are the most desirable commonly found fossils on the Jurassic coast, and they happen to be my favorite type of fossil. I do own several ammonite fossils, but none from Lyme Regis yet, so I am anxious to go there and get some. I like to think that Jane collected some during her stays in Lyme, possibly to give to her nieces and nephews, or to keep for herself, although we have no record of that as of yet. Or perhaps she's bought some in the Anning's fossil shop. Jane visited Lyme when fossils were just becoming popular among the general public after being puzzled over by naturalists for centuries, if not millennia. Mary Anning, the famous fossilist and mother of paleontology, or at least I think of her as such, made many fossil discoveries along the beaches of Lyme. After her father died in 1810, when she was only 10 or 11, she and her brother continued his side business of collecting and selling curiosities, or fossils, as we know them today, along the beaches and cliffs near her home. They kept their poor working class family afloat through their fossil shop, and Mary eventually discovered the first plesiosaur and ichthyosaur. So the plesiosaur is that top fossil image, and the ichthyosaur is the bottom. Both are marine reptiles, not dinosaurs. But these discoveries made her as respected as a poor woman could be among the celebrated geologists of the day. She and her friend Elizabeth Philpott became expert fossilists, helping to find, preserve, draw, and describe and write about many of the most important Jurassic fossil finds in England, if not the world, all from Lyme Regis. The same wind and water that continually necessitate repairs and rebuilding in the town, and freshen the cheeks and spirits of young ladies like Anne Elliot, also wear away at the rocky cliffs, causing dangerous landslides, including one Mary barely escaped from, but that did end up killing her little dog Trey, depicted here in this drawing. But the danger gave Lyme an element of the sublime that attracted tourists and also exposed the ancient life preserved in the rocks, leading Mary to many astonishing finds throughout her life. Today, you can visit the Lyme Regis Museum, built on the site of Mary's home and her original fossil shop, where you can find plenty of displays devoted to Mary Anning, including her own wing of the building, and even a few exhibits on Jane Austen. Okay, I'm a geologist, so I need to talk a little bit more about the geology of the area, because it's so fascinating. Recent landslides, including the one that occurred in May of 2008, and is depicted in this map at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide, are a continuing testament to the danger and the unearthing of interesting things that coexist in Lyme Regis. The landslides can be deadly, and thankfully this one was not, even though it was the biggest landslide in the area in the last century, but they can also expose new rock and fossils for the curious to explore. This particular landslide is part of what is known as the Black Ven landslide complex, an ominous name, but the complex is filled with incredibly fascinating shales and mudstones containing multitudes of preserved organisms. As part of the Jurassic coast of England, it is protected against major excavations, But when nature does the excavating, there are plenty of potential discoveries for modern Janeites and fans of Mary Anning today. I would love to go and find my own lime ammonites like those in this weathered limestone called ammonite pavement. So how else is Mary connected to our dear author? Mary's father had a brief association with the Austens during their 1804 stay in Lyme, as evidenced by Jane's letter to Cassandra, in which she wrote, quote, "I have written to Mr. Pym on the subject of the broken lid. It was valued by Anning here, we are told, at 5 shillings, and as that appeared to us beyond the value of all the furniture in the room together, we have referred ourselves to the owner," unquote. Richard Anning, Mary Anning's father, was the apparently incompetent cabinet maker the Austens were hoping could fix their broken lid at a reasonable cost. But Anning did not fool the shrewd Jane Austen. Or maybe she was just being cheap. This is not an auspicious connection, but whether or not Jane ever saw the child Mary or entered the Anning's fossil shop, both women had a remarkable impact on aspects of 19th century culture, one literary and the other scientific, through, in varying degrees, their discoveries at Lyme Regis. As a Janeite and a geologist, Lyme Regis holds a particular appeal for me, and I am determined to go there someday to explore and make my own discoveries in the spirit of both of these remarkable women. Until that time, I can read Jane's novels and the many biographies about Mary Anning, and even watch the 2 upcoming movies about the fossilist. One of them is more documentary style, called Mary Anning and the Dinosaur Hunters. And the other one is called Ammonite and stars Kate Winslet, I believe, as Mary Anning, and Saoirse Ronan as Charlotte Murchison, which I find interesting because Charlotte was older than Mary Anning. But anyway, she sells seashells by the seashore. The shells she sells are yeah, I'm sure. And now we're going to watch a short clip of the 1971 video version or film version of Persuasion.